Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and this is tape number 486. No, that was last week. It's tape 487, and it is April 1981, April the 5th, 1981. I was looking at the sheet that accompanied our broadcast last week when I was talking to you. You know, these are taped right off the air and put on tape cassettes, and I have the accompanying bibliography that's available for all of you if you want it, that goes with the tapes, with the sources of information and the date the articles were produced or the books and where I get my information, so that you know it isn't coming from the top of my head. It's really a series of reviews of things that I see in the paper and put together and share with you. And last week's tape I did on KLRB and took the printed sheet to be copied in Pacific Grove and left the cassette at the tape center. And the title of the printed sheet of last week's broadcast was "The Top Dogs Are Fighting Musical Chairs. Who will kill their team members off, or will they kill us first?" And in essence, last week what I was talking about was that it was absolutely necessary that this last week or immediately that the United States either have a military coup d'etat or go to war in Poland, because there is so much coming out in the news about the CIA and the assassination teams and the missing millions of dollars in the counterintelligence espionage that's been going on for the past 20 or 30 years, and specifically the last 10 years, that it was necessary to call a halt and shut up some of these investigations. And because George Bush was director of the Central Intelligence Agency and has a handle on all of this, and Mr. Haig can take care of the international situation, he wanted to be head of the crisis team before Ronald Reagan was shot and was pushed out. I realized that there would be some bullets flying, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. And if you want the tape of last week, you can get it. I won't repeat what I had on the air last week. I did mention that at the top of the sheet that Alexander Haig is angry. He wants both domestic and foreign emergency power and is ready for a quick mood and a move in the White House. And all of you saw Alexander Haig this week taking over his constitutional succession, which he did not, in fact, get from the Constitution. On the sheet, I mentioned the importance of the scandals in Nigeria with counterintelligence money at this time linked to missing money in the Wells Fargo banks in California. And the father of John Hinckley was in Nigeria for a long period of time and has deep involvement in Biafra in Nigeria for the Central Intelligence Agency. I didn't know the name Hinckley, but I knew Nigeria was involved. I also mentioned Tennessee as being a key point in this coup or junta, and he was also in Nashville, Tennessee, and had contacts and telephone calls there and was protected by the police. He was released in 34 minutes with a small fine, having weapons at the airport, 50 rounds of ammunition and 3 weapons. At the time the president was there, President Carter, in Nashville, Tennessee. In 34 minutes, he was not only released, but the FBI didn't tell the Secret Service that there was a John Hinckley. He had protection of the major law enforcement in the country. And I also connected missing money of the Wells Fargo Bank, $3.5 million, to Nashville, Tennessee. And he did indeed spend a lot of time in Hollywood, California. It was the Hollywood branch where this was missing. And I suggested that this was espionage money going directly to Nashville, Tennessee. And Hinckley went from Denver, Colorado, to California and spent 2 days there with whoever the contacts were. And I believe this is the final processing station for mind control of all the major assassinations coming down the pike. And then he went directly to Washington, D.C. So I was hitting the Hollywood branch of the Wells Fargo with espionage money, and the Tennessee connections and the Nigerian connections and General Haig and Bush and even more. And I was pretty close because that time, 12 hours later, I learned about Hinckley, but I didn't know who he was, but I knew that these were areas that had to be hushed up and were deeply involved in espionage. Now, whenever I'm on KLRB and we have a crisis, the John Lennon shooting or Nelson Rockefeller's death or the Polish Pope taking over after one Pope lived 30 days, and various Jonestown, I can enumerate endless crises. People call the house and the phone rings about every 3 minutes, and I'm on radio stations that call from around the country, and people want to know, what are you going to say next week? And once the crisis is over or the mourning is over for Lenin or whatever, people go back to whatever they're doing until the next crisis comes. And one of the problems is that they say in discussing these events, you talk too fast. Your names are too many. It's mind-boggling. The connections aren't clear. And that becomes the excuse for people who've had their momentary wailing to go back into that ostrich syndrome. People who take these tape cassettes every week or listen to KLRB the past 9 years, and the 2 years I took a timeout, they were subscribing to the tapes I continued to make, are not confused by the events. They can read the newspapers, they send articles and books and clippings, and they collect and comprehend perfectly. There isn't anything mysterious about what I'm saying, and it's been an orderly succession for 9 years. And if you turn it on once every crisis, naturally, it's hard to pick up the connecting links. I might say that there's no news service in the world that makes the connections between an event they're describing and the past. I was looking up something in the World Book about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and when that event took place in 1971, they didn't go into the role of the French in Indonesia or Allen Dulles in Vietnam or bring you up to date where Daniel Ellsberg came from at the time he took the papers from RAND, the government think tank. They had the scandal. The government documents were revealed by an employee. But a lot of the work before and after is up to you. There's nobody and no article that takes you through a whole series of events that preceded that crisis. It's impossible to do that, and I think that people that complain about that are looking for excuses not to take these situations into their own hand. Political assassinations and coup d'etat, where a country is overthrown with violence or any kind of chicanery, where the government changes hands, is an exact science. I've done it for 17 years, and I can predict within several years or a week or 4 to 5 days when these deaths are going to occur. That happened in 1968 when Rose Kennedy was on the peninsula. May 28th, and I put a letter in her hand telling her exactly how Robert Kennedy would be killed. I'm not psychic, but I had done my research, watched the teams and the team members, and am pretty astute at doing that. It doesn't mean that I can fix my plumbing if it's broken, or sing in an opera, or have other skills or technology, or look through a microscope at cells and make diagnosis. Each person has an individual skill and talent that he does that I can't equal. But there are researchers studying history who can offer a lot to you if you want to know it. And the difference between studying these assassinations and the coup d'etat or the grab for power of Alexander Haig or putting the director of the CIA into the White House, these things should be studied in addition to what other skill you have, because they involve your survival. These people have their finger on the doomsday buttons. They're building bunkers of cement worth billions of dollars for their own safe, not for you. They're talking about limited nuclear war. They have nowhere to put their pollution or their weapons systems. They're on the books for intent to slave labor. They won't pass the anti-genocide law even after Nuremberg all this time. They are handing out dope. They're spraying marijuana with paraquat and poison so that the younger generation are getting cancer. You're dealing with a group of crazy people who really should be with psychiatrists having their heads examined. And they are a team of assassins that have been in power since World War II, since they started the National Security Council. And they collect your taxes. They tell you if you're 18 when to register. They'll tell you what desert to fight in or what jungle to fight in, to come home to have no home or health plan, and find acid rain and pollution and poison in your food, so that whatever talent you have, in addition to that, you have to study them. I didn't want to spend so much time studying them, but survival is important. If you don't want to survive, do you want your children to, or your family or friends? If you don't care about anything, go on doing nothing. But if you want to survive, you're going to have to put some energy into understanding those maniacs that are in office. And when you know they're maniacs, then you can say, why, next week or 12 hours later, they're going to have to start shooting each other, because there are so many scandals, murderous scandals, the Jonestown story, the SLA, the whole California violence syndrome that they've been pulling for years in order to get their SWAT teams and Reichstag terrorism going. and I say they're idiots, that we have to study and understand these people and put some energy into stopping them. And when you understand them, you know their next move almost down to the minute they do it. Now, speaking of assassinations, this week was a major victory for me and my friends and co-workers, those of us that survived and those of us doing the work now, but particularly a group of 5 or 6 or 7 of us that have still stayed with the story of the John Kennedy assassination since the day John Kennedy was murdered. It was the Robert Hartman and Jack Anderson on national television. It was the NBC show, April the 4th, 1981, where they were discussing with Robert Blakey that there was, in fact, a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. Now, if those of us have stayed that long into studying this subject, then you should listen to what we have to say again about George Bush and Alexander Haig and what they have in store for you for the next 17 years. Jack Anderson had to eat humble pie and talk about the fact that David Ferrie and Carlos Marcello and the anti-Castro Cubans were involved in killing John Kennedy. Well, to say on national television, Good Morning America, that David Ferrie and the anti-Castro Cubans played a role in killing the President of the United States is like saying the Defense Department and the CIA did it, because both of those people worked with the CIA. David Ferrie worked with Clay Shaw, Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, with the Nazis of World War II, and Werner von Braun and the group at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and a group down in Chile, the Colonial Dignidad Nazis that have been overthrowing this country. And to hear it in the morning news, just as one other newscast, was just an amazing thing, because unless you've really studied this, you don't know how many years we have taken of crap from Jack Anderson and Robert Hartman, and they're still trying to pull it with you now. They're trying to say that that coup this week, or this attempted coup, was because this assassin, or would-be assassin, and I'll refer to him as an assassin because I don't think Ronald Reagan is going to pull through this in the long run. He's going to die as a result of it. So I'm going to refer to him as the assassin and the coup and tell you why. But these people want to tell you that he had a crush for Jodie Foster, and the motive is solved, never going into the links of the family, the money, the travels, the telephone calls, the contracts, the weapons, the Nazi connections that we'll cover this week and next week as much as we can. Hearing Jack Anderson and Robert Hartman talk about the intelligence community, or the agents of the community, killing John Kennedy 17 years later, reminded me of a song from the play Flora the Red Menace that Liza Minnelli sings called It's a Quiet Thing. Just a few words and we'll go on to Ronald Reagan. The words are, when it all comes true just the way you planned, it's funny that the bells don't ring. It's a quiet thing. When you hold the world in your trembling hand, you think you hear a choir sing, but it's a quiet thing. And many of us who did the research, we knew we were honest and truthful with all of you. I've been on the air starting my 10th year this spring, and we were telling you the truth. The song goes on, I don't hear the drums, I don't hear the bands, the sounds I'm told such moments bring, but happiness comes in on tiptoe. Well, what do you know? It's a quiet thing, a very quiet thing. I don't even think I would have heard the broadcast. A listener who lives over in Pacific Grove called me and said they're going to talk about the assassination of John Kennedy, and it was really a satisfaction to me and my coworkers to see them just quietly, as if it was a news story. Oh, there's a conspiracy that killed the President of the United States. Just about the same week that Ronald Reagan is gunned down in Washington, D.C. Now we'll get on to the Ronald Reagan story, and next week I'm going to update you on some more that is directly linked to the Reagan command, but I don't want to go into it this evening. One is that Harold Smith has been arrested in Los Angeles. He's the fellow that made the leaks of the Nigerian connections to the Wells Fargo Bank, to the Japanese mafia, to the counterintelligence operations going on there for 8 or 10 years. They picked him up on a false passport application. The FBI has him, and just as there had to be a coup, they had to pull in Harold Smith, and we'll see what happens. Also, there's a link between the tape that I did March the 1st a month ago, what I call the biggest stories that will tangle together. That was a curious case of the disappearing actress, Valerie McDonald, Michael Hennessy, and another Philip Thompson, and a man named Abbott. John Gordon Abbott linked to Nazi parties, bank robberies, secret information about dispatchers of money transactions, the names of the Brinks drivers, the Loomis trucks, the names of their children, their social security numbers, and so forth. And I knew that this was the beginning of another Chowchilla episode. Now they've linked that team that I talked about a month ago to the murders in Davis, California, of 2 students up in Davis. And then the Zodiac is back at work, pictures of the Zodiac killer in California, which is one of Ronald Reagan's counterintelligence violences. We'll do more of that next week. I just want you to know they're in the news. And also, Maxine Cheshire did a column that George Corcola was murdered in the Netherlands. He worked as a CIA agent with Edmund Wilson and Frank Turple. Those were the CIA men that worked with the Alpha 66 anti-Castro Cubans. He wanted to come to the United States and get protection in exchange for not being charged with a gun-running operation. But he works with Carlos Ramirez and Samuel Cummings, the world's greatest weapons merchant at this point, living in London and Monte Carlo. And Maxine Cheshire wrote in the Washington Post that instead of Corcola coming home to testify, to show that the counterintelligence terrorism is coming from the right, from the CIA, funding terrorism to disguise as Russian or Middle East terrorism funded by the CIA, she wrote that he was murdered in the Netherlands and will not appear. And one last point on California violence. I got a letter from Joe Holsinger, the aide to Leo Ryan, and I'm not wandering too far from Reagan because these are all Reagan's babies in California. Stanford Research, UCLA Mind Control Program. I got a letter from Gabrielle Weber, who lives in Berlin, Germany, to Holsinger, that a fellow over in Berlin is linking Timothy Stone, the man who set up Jim Jones in Jonestown, with Donald DeFreeze and the counterintelligence program at Vacaville and the Phoenix program in Vietnam, that Tim Stone set up the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and Colston Westbrook, as well as setting up the operation of Jonestown. And I did say many, many weeks that these operations would link, and they would link to the Australian bank, the CIA bank in Australia, known as the Nuganan Bank, and tie up to the California bank system up and down California that has used mind control and experimentation upon human beings to create SWAT teams and terrorist tactics. And so these stories, I'll do many more in the weeks to come, but I want you to know that they're in the news and current right now. I'm not forgetting them. Now, about that gunning down of Ronald Reagan this week, many of you read, of course, the relationship of Neil Bush to Scott Hinckley, the brother of John Hinckley that shot Ronald Reagan on the street. Mr. Bush, our vice president, George Bush, says that they were just casual acquaintances. They were going to have dinner the night after the assassination was to take place. If Reagan was murdered on Monday, they had scheduled a dinner together in the home of Bush's son in Denver, Colorado, and Scott Hinckley was friendly with the Bush family. The news media, you notice, is playing this very lightly and going into the Jodie Foster story. I remember the time that when Sirhan was arrested in Los Angeles and Mayor Yorty exclaimed, "It's a communist that killed Robert Kennedy," because Sirhan's brother was parked down the street from where some suspected Reds lived, and therefore that was a communist conspiracy, having his car on the street. But you get a wall of silence now when the Bushes and the Hinkleys know each other, one working for Standard Oil of Indiana and the other having much in common with George Bush. What do they have in common? Because George Bush would succeed if Ronald Reagan dies from poisons that were in that bullet, and I believe there were. They have oil money, lots of oil money, and energy in common. They have the CIA in common. I believe the Hinckley family is totally a CIA operation. I went into the chronology of that family very carefully, at least what's come out so far. They lived in Dallas, Texas, and had a lot of money, a $200,000 or $300,000 home. He worked as a volunteer for an African, in Biafra in Africa, for a church group from Southern California. And yet he was a tiny oil and gas company with a big home. The Wall Street Journal describes the money they had in 1973 when they moved to Denver, Colorado, and the holdings for the company was half of the price of the home they lived in, while he did volunteer work in Nigeria with a Christian group in California. But we'll do more on the thickness of the CIA in common. George Bush was director of the CIA, and And I believe that the Hinckley family was deeply involved with the Central Intelligence Agency. He had a president of the Vanderbilt Energy, it's called, and at the time of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, Vanderbilt Energy was under investigation by the federal agency for $2 million overcharge. Imagine a federal government investigating hours before the president is killed, a corporation in Denver, Colorado, and the son of the president of that corporation is meeting the next evening after the feds are there with the son of the vice president of the United States. They had Texas in common. Hinckley made his money in Texas, lived in Dallas, Texas. George Bush is from Texas, and they had Nigeria in common because of the contacts of Biafra and John Hinckley Sr., and also the problems in Nigeria and Angola that the CIA was having also at the time of Jonestown, that Leo Ryan exposed as being actually anti-Castro Cubans and not Castro Cubans down in Angola. George Bush is from Texas, and the night or the day that Ronald Reagan was to be killed or planned to be killed, Bush was out there in Fort Worth, Texas at the time, the old home territory where Hinckley grew up and the family lived. They have the CIA in common in the terms of Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for the Central Intelligence Agency, and I'll do more about Williams in a minute. He was John Connolly's attorney at the time of Watergate. He was a Washington Post attorney at the time Deep Throat was working, and they were squeezing Richard Nixon out to get Alexander Haig and Mr. Butterfield into control of the White House at the time. They've hired the highest attorney of the Central Intelligence Agency to represent their son, when the man who would have succeeded if the son had killed him was the former director of the CIA, and there really are no ex-CIA people. At the time, Richard Helms was charged with perjury, lying about the killing of Allende down in Chile. Williams represented him too. And this week, if Reagan gets better, or soon, he was to entertain Mr. Pinochet, the man who killed Salvador Allende down in Chile. There is a thick can of worms between Richard Helms, the CIA, and George Bush, who became director of the CIA, and Williams, who was the attorney for Richard Helms, who is representing the Hinckley family and their son at this time. The prosecutor on this case, at least the first one that John Hinckley Jr. saw, is Charles Ruff, who did a miserable job prosecuting the Watergate defendants, and they all got off easy. And because there's direct links to the entire Watergate team of Butterfield, Haig, and Bush, I don't see that anyone associated with, from the John Kennedy assassination up to Watergate and beyond, should be handling this case at all. And of course, Standard Oil of Indiana is involved because of George Bush's son being a director of Standard Oil of Indiana, and that company was involved in the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, the bag woman for the CIA at the time of Watergate. And if Dorothy Hunt had lived, maybe none of these people would be in power today. They're in power because the secrets were stopped, and when they blew up her plane, they learned how to silence a lot of other people that had information. So that this military junta had a very nice package there with George Bush and Alexander Haig, and I think it is a disgrace that this family was so close and intimate in Denver, Colorado, and uses a CIA attorney and seems to be a CIA dummy front. And Ronald Reagan is gunned down with these people just right behind the scenes, ready to pick up the pieces. There was an article in the San Jose Mercury, Who is John Hinckley? And it goes into a belief that he was a drug user in Denver, Colorado. That was one of the points they brought out. Well, so were the Hells Angels, and so were the Nazi parties and the Manson family and what they call the street people. He belonged to the Nazi party. He was part of their stormtrooper. He had a lot of activity with the far right wing, and one way they finance their activity in their travels is by dealing drugs and weapons, and we've talked about that on many programs. Now, Mr. and Mrs. John W. Hinckley, the parents, let out a little trial balloon in the newspaper through a friend this week. This was a United Press story and Associated Press, April the 4th. And I'll have a few quotations here that remind me of veiled threats that William Colby was giving Howard Baker at the time of Watergate if they went too far into their investigations. And these are from this newspaper article in quotes. It says, the parents may break their silence soon after they see their son. They've hired CIA attorney Edward Bennett Williams, and they may soon break their silence. The next quotation is, they would not divulge their exact plans, but they indicated that after they saw their son, they would go to Washington, D.C. before next week. William Sells, a neighbor, said, it is not appropriate for me to reveal any element of their plans. He also said once the Hinckleys visit their son, they will consider a suitable arrangement to feed the press if their lawyers agree. These came over all the wire services this last week. They also said a doctor who was a family friend from the start of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, when they found out their son was involved, came to the house but said the parents required no special treatment at this time. I imagine that if they're going to blackmail the CIA or get involved in the scandalous operation of their own company, where Mr. Hinckley quickly stepped away, they took the names off the doors, he walked out, there's no identification with him to the company, that Vanderbilt Energy, he's closed shop and run away. That is silly behavior for a man who has 1/6 son to leave a $4.5 million operation, unless you're so deeply involved in the intelligence system that you have to get out, just as the dummy fronts had to do at the time that Watergate was falling apart. Another quotation was, the Hinckleys talked with their son by telephone twice. Now, so far, John Hinckley hasn't killed anybody, and I did a lot of work with prisoners and prison reform for a long time, and it was very few people except Dan White and the John Hinckleys that get telephones where they're in contact with their parents and family. It isn't that easy. Another part of this article said a week before the shooting, John left his car in the family garage and indicated to his parents he was going to California. All the articles up to now, this is Sunday and the shooting took place Monday, have him taking a Delta airline into Nashville, Tennessee, either from Atlanta, Georgia, or Chicago, taking American Airline from Nashville, Tennessee, either to New Haven, Connecticut, or New York, taking a $33 taxi ride in Nashville from the airport to a hotel. And outside of that, there hasn't been any message of what kind of car he drives or what he has, but he has a car, and he was deeply in touch with his family right up to the time he went to California. He never worked except 1 week in his life, and the car is left at the family house, but he carried on by foot or thumb or espionage wherever he went, and this is a period of 6 or 7 years that are unaccounted for, except for picking up Mein Kampf and Nazi meetings in St. Louis, Missouri, and checking into a university occasionally from 1973 to 1980 until the fall. He had a lot of time to learn how to shoot. They had a lot of time to do mind control. They had a lot of time to train him for kamikaze work, too. And that is one of the clues to this kind of operation, was the use of kamikaze, and I'll go into that in a minute. The family said that they have no indication of his hostile acts before, but they will go to Washington, and as I say, they will consider a suitable arrangement to feed the press if their lawyers agree, and their attorney is this Edward Bennett Williams, who's had the most important CIA cases for the director of the CIA, William Telbs, at the time of the Watergate, of any attorney in the United States, and that's a lot of it. So they're setting out their veiled threats, and I'll do more about this. I will refer to him as the assassin and tell you why I don't think Ronald Reagan is going to pull through this easily. We'll take a break now at the end of the first 30 minutes, and we'll do some more about Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt and the prognosis for the future, and John Hinckley and his family.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Come on down, we need you. Join us at the YW. Come on down, we need you. Join us at the YW. Sisters, come together. We can face the stormy weather. Don't you feel we can make things new?
World Watchers International.
Okay, this is Mae, back for 30 more minutes on the events that took place this last week. Typical of Ronald Reagan, when he was well enough to ask questions about who gunned him down, he asked the usual question, what is the democratic description of my near assassin? That means, tell me, please, he's a communist, tell me he's a Jew, is he black, is he on welfare? Give me that demographic, geographic, Latino. Let's get going with it. We can't condone violence, okay? But the CIA wasn't very nice to Ronald Reagan this time. I mean, they were really upfront. They said, Your Majesty, I hate to tell you, but he's blonde and he's got blue eyes and he's been going to college for the last 6 years and he's from Texas, oil money, very rich, home worth a couple $100,000. His father is president of Vanderbilt Energy in Denver, Colorado, and his children, friends of Vice President Bush. Devoutly Christian family. The father supports Christian groups and organizations. They live in a white Christian neighborhood. He's had all that money could buy. He loves the Nazi Party, and he reads Mein Kampf, and he goes as a stormtrooper in St. Louis and Chicago. And he's not a welfare cheater. He's the all-American boy, the good Christian family Boy Scout. You wouldn't want more. That's the demographic description of your near assassin. And then Ronald Reagan says, put another tube in. I can't handle it. What am I going to do with these good Christian Americans? I mean, how do you know where to look for people anymore? But it's so typical of his mentality. But if he went a little further, when he was head of the Rockefeller Committee to investigate assassinations after Watergate, he would have known that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with Mr. Rockwell of the American Nazi Party and that James Earl Ray worked with Nazis in St. Louis and down in Memphis, Tennessee. Also, and that Sirhan worked with the Greek Orthodox Church and the CIA conduit, Richard Nixon's friends, that brought them all to Pasadena. And he would also look back in history and know that the same profile of this Hinckley that you don't hear about on the media is exactly like all the other violences they pulled. That Whitman boy in the Tower of Texas, John Conley, took his brains and sent them to Boston as an excuse to experiment on blacks to see while they riot. He was a good Christian, a Boy Scout, a perfect youth, no trouble until he started shooting at the Texas University, and that began the real mind control program of the United States that moved from Boston to UCLA that Ronald Reagan was inaugurating. With his doctor, Jolly West, who also came in on the SLA case as the great expert and now has quotations in the news about John Hinckley. The Manson family, the same thing. Charles Manson didn't kill those people. In Los Angeles, Tex Watson, choir boy, good Christian, came from Texas, went out to California, worked with Beverly Hills attorneys. Who would guess he'd come in your home at night, Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca, and get your stomachs cut open and put helter-skelter and try to make it look like the Beatles and the Black Panthers did it? John Warnock Hinckley isn't any different than all the others who've been trained to kill, who've been brought up in this racist society by the intelligence community with their minds controlled. That Dr. Shock that was operating on people in Jonestown without anesthetic, with enough drugs for a population of 60,000, and there were only less than 1,000 there. He came from Houston, Texas, too, and went to medical school in California. And the man who killed Alan Lowenstein, former congressman in New York, was also from California, brainwashed through mind control programs and picked up his weapon out in Houston, Texas. Texas and California have strong patterns together, and if Ronald Reagan didn't know that now, he never will, so it's just too bad. But as Alan Dulles said at the first meeting of the Warren Commission, he brought a book for them to read on past assassinations, and he said, gentlemen, there's a pattern that runs through all these, and if you understand these past assassinations based on my little book that was started in 1954, that's when the CIA was overthrowing Mossadegh and putting in the Shah. He says, if you read this book, you'll see that there's a pattern running through these assassinations. And the CIA has made sure that they give you the patterns and not the hospitals and the location of where they get their guns and so forth. Alan Dulles brought that to the meeting. And John J. McCloy, president of Chase Manhattan Bank on the Warren Commission, said, well, the Lincoln assassination was a plot. And Alan Dulles said, yes, but one man was so dominant that it almost wasn't a plot. Isn't that pathetic? A man that was an executive of the OSS, the CIA, that formed these teams, who's telling the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Mr. Chairman, and John J. McCloy of Chase Manhattan Bank, it was so dominant it almost wasn't a plot. And that's exactly what you get with this John Warlock Hinkle. His name is, I call him Warlock Hinkle for reasons that I will get into this week or next week. Now, when these assassination attempts take place, I keep a chronology. If you hear paper rattling, it's because I've just brought in the large charts instead of cards to share with you. And I make a chronology going down a huge tablet from 1970 to 1981, all the activity of the Hinckley family, and every article that falls in about them or where they were, I put it into those time slots. Then I break it down even further into John Hinckley from September 1980 up through March 81, and every article that has them at a certain location at a certain time, because you find all of a sudden it overlays. And then the major classifications that I study each and every one of these assassinations falls into A, important questions to ask that remain unanswered, and then 17 years later, as in the Kennedy assassination, they'll tell you, yes, there was a conspiracy. There are major questions such as, what did John Warnock Hinckley Sr. do before 1970 in Dallas, Texas, to pay for the $250,000 home? If he was doing volunteer work in Africa and Biafra, how did he buy the home, and who paid for him? Because when he moved up to Denver, Colorado, according to Wall Street Journal, he had $120,000 in asset in 1970, and he moved immediately into a very expensive area and always had money, and you don't get that volunteering for some little church group in Nigeria, believe me. So the question is, how did he get his money? So I have a huge page of important questions on these people. Then I break down the real motives for the assassination attempt. Cui bono, who gains? It's certainly, it's a very obvious line of succession here of people that have been clawing for power. As a matter of fact, George Bush and Haig both wanted to be president and didn't get the nomination. So there's nothing they'd like better besides having direct links to these people through the intelligence agency and the Defense Department, and being so darn obvious about it this time. They both want to be president, and they will be president. I break down the links of this person, John Hinckley, to the military, the evidence that he's under mind control, where he got it, and the telephone messages of different people, different cities, the links of this person to the Defense Department and the CIA, the locations of the cities where he's been, such as Evergreen, Colorado, Yale University at New Haven, Lubbock, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, back to Denver, Colorado, and Los Angeles, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago with the Nazi Party, St. Louis with the Nazi Party. And I take the various trips and the modus operandi of the traveling, and then the case, are there other people involved? That column, for example, under each space, I put the source of the information, like San Francisco Chronicle, April the 4th, 1981. They said he may have been involved with somebody else in Washington, D.C. before he went to the Hilton Hotel. There were 2 local telephone calls from his room on Monday. He stayed 2 blocks from the White House. Before leaving, he said, are there any messages? Then April the 2nd, the Los Angeles Times said that the Justice Department in Denver is keeping a search warrant, going over documents under seal, telling the FBI it is investigating John Hinckley and possibly others. The papers contain information that, if revealed publicly, could hamper their investigation. This is the Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Roberts. The L.A. Times had an article that Hinckley received funds from wealthy parents, but he also got from other sources, but they won't say other persons who. He would pawn a dagger and pick up a few $100s, but that hardly paid for airplane fare, hotel fare, and contacts. So he was intermittently getting money, according to the bank records, from parents and others. But they will not say who the and others are, but money was coming into his account. Los Angeles Times had an article April the 2nd. His checking account records from 1979 to 1980, that's when he started picking up the weapons, most of it is from his parents. See, this is just one column of others involved. So everything that I see in all the newspapers I'm getting, I put the source and the intimation that there's someone else involved. Another article in the L.A. Times from Nashville, Tennessee, he paid cash for his hotel, $30.73. He made 6 local telephone calls in Tennessee. He knows somebody there. He made them from that hotel. He stayed one day, then he checked at another hotel. There's a chance that there are doubles involved, and I have a column on that, because a person believed to be John Hinckley was in Hollywood at a Hollywood motel. A person running that hotel said he was there in the afternoon of the 23rd, and John Hinckley didn't get there until 5 o'clock to the L.A. airport. So this person was seeing a John Hinckley earlier. And also, they said he left Denver to be with friends in California, and friends and neighbors mentioned that he had friends in California, and they're not talking about it. Also, he made local calls, as I say, before checking out of Nashville at the Opryland Hotel. And the Secret Service was there because Jimmy Carter was going to be at the hotel, so he checked to the Downtown or Central Hotel, where he made 3 local calls in his room. He made 3 there, and then they didn't determine from the time he checked out of the hotel, which is 15 minutes from the airport, until he left Nashville to go either to New Haven, Connecticut, or New York. He had 2 hours, which is unaccounted. So there's a question of others involved. He was seeing someone. There was someone that resembled him in another location, and they were wrong about the time. And another record said that he left his home in Denver, Colorado, March 25th, and said, I'm going to California. And then the next day, he took the Greyhound bus to go to Washington, D.C. Well, that is untrue. Somebody by the name of John Hinckley was in California on the 23rd of March, and he left after the 25th to go to Washington, D.C. So always in this story, there are people, lookalikes, who look like them, and I keep a record of them. Now, last week, I'll go some more on the charts and questions with you for the next few weeks and show you maybe have a diagram for you of the funding, the income, the family backgrounds, and as I say, the chronology, the modus operandi, where they get the weapons, and links to the police department or the FBI and the government, and then come down with a composite of who this I call him John Warlock Hinckley instead of Warnock Hinckley. Now, last week, what preceded the shooting of Ronald Reagan? Newsweek had a cover which is dated April the 6th, 1981. And on the cover is General Haig. And when you know how to read the news media, you get a pretty good idea of what's coming down. Now, I didn't see this when I was on KLRB Sunday night. It came out Monday, but there's a cover story of General Haig titled, Who is in Charge Here? Power Struggle in the White House. Haig versus the White House. And there's a reference in there to kamikaze actions in the article in the Newsweek. Now, that's interesting because there's a rock group in Denver, Colorado that John Hinckley was particularly close to called the Kamikaze Clones. And I've seen movies of kamikaze clones of Idi Amin trained by the CIA in Uganda. And the letter that he left at his hotel, that telltale diary letter saying the president will be killed and he wants to die. And there's a lot of talk about death. In that letter, he's ready to die. And he was linked to, very closely associated to the kamikaze clones. And also the word kamikaze was in the Newsweek this last week. They also had a picture of Jodie Foster in Newsweek this past week on page 88. She's the girl at Yale University that he was supposed to be infatuated with. The FBI, incidentally, was saying that they're absolutely sure there was no conspiracy, but they wouldn't be this firm next time. There's a quotation to the effect that they'll withhold it. They're sure there's no conspiracy, but they'll hold back this time until they're absolutely positive. Newsweek also had a picture of Ronald Reagan in his riding habit, and he's smiling and going off to ride his horse. That scene was taken before he was airlifted to Quantico, Virginia, to the Marine base. And it's very interesting that as soon as John Warnock Hinckley was arrested, instead of staying in a jail in Washington, D.C., like all the other assassins or would-be assassins are placed, he was taken out to Quantico, Virginia, to the same Marine base where Ronald Reagan was a few days earlier. It's one reason to believe that the CIA and the military is highly involved in this. They separated him from everybody else, and even when a president is killed, the suspect is not taken to a military base. With the combination of Edward Bennett Williams of the CIA and the Marine base, he's much in control of the military, who are now giving him Valium plus other prescription of medication, so that when he gets his tests or interviews, I'm sure that his little brain will be completely erased of whatever it was he did or who he knew before he was in front of the Hilton Hotel last week. As I say, last week I mentioned that the shooting would start, but the Washington Post had an article, and they also were so instrumental in sliding Richard Nixon out of making ready for Haig and Butterfield and this new team at the time of Watergate. The Washington Post had a front-page story the day of the assassination attempt, and many of their staff are full-time CIA people, and they worked with Deep Throat and the Central Intelligence Agencies at the height of Watergate, pulling a lot of shenanigans. The Washington Post had a story on George Bush, and besides the front page, they had an entire full page of the newspaper called The Team Player, George Bush, How the Outsider Quietly Moved to the Inside. Well, a few bullets and he'll be inside. It wasn't very quiet if you saw a replay of the events. And there was George Bush, former director of the CIA, a Texas oil man, former ambassador to China, out of Fort Worth at the time of the shooting, friends of the Hinckley family, and he's ready to take over. And they had a full-page picture of him, and they had Haig on the cover of Newsweek, which is owned by Washington Post, and a full page of Bush, as if they were just really ready to take over. And speaking of Edward Bennett Williams, I mentioned besides John Connally that he was an attorney for at the time of Watergate. He also was attorney for Bobby Baker, for Gulf and Western, for Jimmy Hoffa, for Senator Joe McCarthy, who worked with Roy Cohn and David Schein, and the Washington Post, and the whole Texas Connally, Bush, Haig, Counterintelligence, Defense Department, CIA assassination team. This whole gang were just out there ganged up against Ronald Reagan, and that's why I think he's going to have a hard time surviving. That's why I read on the air last week the names of the large group of military people and armament builders who were at a dinner that Jody Jacobs described for Alexander Haig in her column in the LA Times just the week before the shooting. And I suggested that with this kind of brass behind Bush, how long does Ronald Reagan have to live? Now, there's a lot of energy and a lot of money behind Alexander Haig. And he got up in front of that microphone, and I don't have to repeat what he said. You heard him. And he took the power. He said the Constitution gave him that power to take over if Vice President Bush was in Texas. If he had just said, I will answer your questions until Vice President Bush comes, that would have been adequate. But he used the Constitution and threw that in as the cloak for his taking authority. And there was certainly guilt and trembling behind the old battle man's face. And I wondered if he realized at the time how visible he was, and that the thing the American people feared so much was his links to Watergate, to the past, removing of Ronald Reagan, the way he did it, the way he took over from Robert Haldeman. I never was a Reagan, I mean Richard Nixon. I get the two so confused because the teams are so lopsided and similar. I believe that this old, tired actor, he spent 35 years getting in office to be in 3 months before he was gunned down like a dog. I do want to mention briefly before I get back to the Hinckley family, and as I say, I'll do a lot more next week, my fears for Ronald Reagan. You saw 4 men shot, 3 reacted one way, and 1 walked or was pushed into a car. But according to some stories, he was still on his feet when he went into the hospital. And I believe if the bullets all came from the same person, they would respond almost similarly to the way they were shot. But Ronald Reagan went a different way, and I believe that there was a different person that shot him. I'm afraid that it will have a poison on it, that he will die from a poisoning. You remember the shooting of Dr. Foster, the SLA, up in Oakland, where Dr. Foster got a cyanide bullet and Dr. Blackburn, his buddy, got a regular bullet. And Foster died immediately. But I think that there could be a lingering death, such as Woodrow Wilson had, or a poison, or a collapsed lung. I'm afraid not the oxide, or maybe the oxide on the bullet, and the FBI didn't tell the doctors for 3 days the composition of the bullet in one of the men who still had it in his body, or what was in the president at the time they were cleaning out the wounds. 4 men were shot, and 1 responded totally differently. And I'm afraid that something is going to happen to him as a result of not the direct hit that would be too drastic, make us look like a banana republic, but slowly he'll take naps, he'll have bleeding or coughing of the lung, and he'll be weak from now on. I don't think he's going to have the strength that he should have. The other thing I was worried about when I saw television and the replays, bringing in several quarts of blood for Ronald Reagan. 4 people had been gunned down seriously. One of them went to another hospital, but it showed a car coming in with 2.5 quarts for Reagan. Why not bring in 50 quarts for 3 people who are going to have a lot of surgery? He lost half of his blood, but what came to my mind, that deja vu, was at the time of Watergate when Herbert Kalmbach, the attorney for the White House, took Martha Mitchell out to a hospital near Long Beach, and she had an ejection. And my first public article was, why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? Because I thought she would get a Jack Ruby type of cancer from the needle shot that she had, that she was physically abducted. And later James McCord revealed that everything I had said in that article was true and that she was a prisoner. And I could see her in 3 years having that terminal, terrible cancer and isolated from her own daughter until she died. She never saw her. So I was worried if there was a special blood. If he didn't die from the gun, is he getting a special blood? The Overthrow magazine put out in New York by A.J. Weberman had a contest when Reagan became president. It's called the Reagan Death Watch Begins, and they give various prizes. And you could predict, you filled out a square, how would he die? By botulism, CIA shellfish fish toxin administered by George Bush, phlebitis, such as Reagan said, if I go in the hospital, they'll kill me. Would he get lost flying backward in time? Would he have skin cancer from Grecian formula hair dye? Would he fall off his horse at the ranch? Maybe at Quantico at the Marine base. They have a list of all kinds of ways that Ronald Reagan would die, and you could almost fill in these squares. Now it's called the Death Watch, and your prize, you could get out of jail free card, you could get a $220,000 bribe from Libyans, immunity from prosecution, a construction for the Malcolm X missile, bribe an FBI agent disguised as an Arab sheik. You could get away with that. You can have a American tourister luggage and ticket to New Zealand, or a congressional investigation of your choice, or it had a list of prizes if you guessed the way the president would be killed. And A.J. Weberman has a picture of a skull called the Seal of the President of the United States, with a skull in the center and Mickey Mouse on top. The Reagan Death Watch begins. But when you talk about the shellfish toxin and the botulism or the poison, I thought of the blood, and often in humor, the very serious things are said in jest, but they are really true. This warning of that psychic, Tamara Rand, out in Los Angeles. She works in L.A. and Las Vegas and out of Atlanta, Georgia, using her hypnotism and ESP. She was found to be a fake, where she said last week that she had predicted January the 6th that Ronald Reagan would be shot in March. But she let out a word which I listened to for clues, because when these things come down, there are certain messages there, and she said he'll have a relapse in July. So I'm marking my calendar, because maybe Tamara Rand and her Institute of Hypnosis will be back in business in July, because if she was lying in January, she'll be right in July. I don't know whether she took that from inside work that she knows, or after the shooting. She was on the air saying this, but she's given it a date. And I think it's something to consider. And I think it fits in with all the humor about Ronald Reagan, saying he would rather be in Philadelphia, or if he knew he'd get so much attention, he would have stayed in Hollywood. Or the silly remarks, the reunion of parties. The news people are picking up jokes and quips, and how he walked in and look how strong this 70-year-old man is. The truth was that he couldn't breathe. He said he wasn't getting oxygen. They didn't send an ambulance for him. Usually you put someone flat and call an ambulance so that they get oxygen or blood if they need it. When he got to the hospital, there was blood coming out of his nose. There was blood coming out of his mouth. He couldn't get air. It was a serious situation. The FBI waited 3 days to tell what kind of bullets were in him. The FBI did not tell the Secret Service that they knew about this person all along. And I have a list of the involvement of the police, the federal agents, and the Secret Service in this miserable story. So I don't think that Ronald Reagan is out of it yet. If the intent was to get him, if the people in power couldn't win the nomination, if they want the power, if they want to stop the scandals at the CIA, the missing millions of money, the names I've been talking about, the counterintelligence operations, if they have to conceal the bankruptcy, the emotional and financial bankruptcy that this country is really in now, it would take a war in Russia, against Russia, or a coup d'etat, or a diversion of a sort, and then the new person in would get carte blanche, and we would give them a year of grace, and they would tighten up their act and wipe out a lot of their witnesses. You can expect quite a few murders or related assassinations to this story, I believe. Now, this is a serious attempt to kill Ronald Reagan after he was in power just 3 months. As I sent a letter to somebody this week, he tried 35 years to be president, and they gave him 3 months. But when you have somebody such as Alexander Haig, who was discovered by Fritz Kramer and Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi intelligence system, and George Bush, the former ambassador to China and director of the CIA, when you have those people there, they think they know Washington, they have the power. You send in a 70-year-old tired actor who didn't do his lines well, who simply loves his horses and his jelly beans, who relegates power, who doesn't care about the details of the activities going on as long as there's a pleasantness, and the news media is feeding it to make him look good, and he can twist their arm and give speeches to the Academy and be ever present in the media, smiling and waving, coming and going on the balcony, entertaining heads of states. When it comes to push and shove and the system's falling apart, they've got to kill the old goat. He's an outsider like Jimmy Carter. These guys have been in Washington from the day one. They know the congressman, they know the espionage system, they know the Justice Department, they know the defense agencies, they know the CIA, and this guy is expendable. He's literally a clown with world figures. He's a movie actor, and they're down to the hard knuckle. Should we get to war and tighten up, and it will solve unemployment, it will solve the diversionary process for things that have gone on, all the failures of foreign policy in Central America, South America, Middle East, and it would be hard to pull it with this old goat. I think they intended to kill him. I don't think he'll live long. I think there's every indication medically that he's going to have relapses, and the reason they gave us these jokes was so when it comes later, he sort of eases out of it. Now, we're in a very serious crisis in this country. We can't solve it in 1 hour. I've been trying for 17 years. I've been sharing with you for 9 years, going on 10, and I will continue to do it. And it's interesting. Study it and read the papers. Don't fall for the cover story, America's violent, or we need gun control, or Jodie Foster inspired him. Read where the guy gets his money. Read where the family gets their money. Collect the stories of the travels, the fascist connections, and then you'll know who's behind one more assassination attempt in the United States of America. And it will go on until we wise up and demand that they stop some of this hanky-panky. Well, the time is up now. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week on the John Hinckley family. In the meantime, take care.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
Over KLRB, Carmel by the Sea.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and this is tape number 488, broadcast number 488, April the 12th, 1981. I have a guest with me this evening, Ray Fabrizio, professor from Monterey Peninsula College, an accomplished musician here on the Monterey Peninsula, who has time to teach and to do his music and also to study current events constantly and turn the students on to what's happening. I've been very lucky on this peninsula. I've been able to express my opinions and research for 9 years at KLRB, and I've been lucky also 2 semesters. Ray and I taught a class at Monterey Peninsula College on the American assassinations, and thanks to Ray and his constant working with young people, we've been able to reach people in this community who've gone over other places elsewhere, and a lot that he's done has reached many, many people. Before I introduce you to Ray, I just want to say I have a book that I really like very much, and it has a list of ways to make life rich and full of meaning. And I was looking at it this week, and I was thinking it describes Ray Fabrizio and the relationship that he has with his research, or that I've known him. It was a book on creative thinking, and the first item was a desire to make things better, alertness to be open to everything, an interest in digging below the surface, curiosity, a constant spirit of inquiry, thoughtfulness leading to thorough understanding, concentration to penetrate matters in depth, the application of your energy and effort, patience to solve problems in detail, optimism, combining enthusiasm and self-confidence, and cooperation, working productively with others. I think those 10 things are very important for the people that I like and respect, and Ray is one of those people. It's really been wonderful knowing you and working with you on this peninsula and sharing information constantly.
Well, thanks, Mia. Gosh, I hope that I have just a few of those qualities that you mentioned, and I think I have also I don't know about the depth. I spread myself so thin. I do have the interest and the awareness, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to devote to these things that I would like to have.
I think you have the depth. I think throwing out new ideas every time there is a holiday, a remembrance of John Kennedy's assassination, or the shooting of John Lennon, or this evening we're going to talk about the near murder or the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan and the comparisons to the John Kennedy assassination, just alerting people to the possibility that there are similarities and sharing them with your students. They always come back, and I hear from them that you're opening up new doors and areas that other people are afraid to do. They're afraid to go into it, and you bring out the possibility, is there more than we're seeing? And that is important. You don't have to tell them what they'll find at the end of the tunnel, but at least tell them to explore it.
Exactly, and I do try to give them hints on how to detect propaganda and how to know when they're being lied to, and then they can be on their own. This is very important, and they need the encouragement to know that someone older with more experience has the same kinds of doubts and questions, and they shouldn't be afraid to doubt and question themselves. This is my job as a teacher, I think.
Well, last week when the shooting took place of Ronald Reagan, I got a phone call from a gentleman on the peninsula who is retired now. He's in the highest levels of military intelligence and in the Army. He was the interpreter at the Gary Powers trial. Peter Thomas, do you know him? He lives on the peninsula.
I know of him.
Yeah, and he's a close friend of mine, and he interpreted for Khrushchev and for Gary Powers, speaks Russian, German, and English. And he was talking about the Reagan shooting, and he believes in the research that we're doing. He said the truth will set you free. He's not afraid of truth coming out. And I said, well, what will we do when another layer of cover-up comes? And he said, do what you're doing, reach the young people, and keep telling them the truth, and eventually forget about the older ones and get to the young people so they can see it. And that's what you do at the college. I hear all the time from the different classes.
Well, I hope I reach a few. I know you do. A lot of my students listen to your show regularly.
Oh, I have one apology now, and then we're going to go on to this evening. It's going to be the comparisons of patterns between the murder of John Kennedy specifically and the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. I have to apologize to my listeners. Last week, a play of words and kind of a little joke, I kept talking about John Warlock Hinkle.
Warlock, right.
Warlock Hinkle. Well, there was one article in the paper that he got a job as a disc jockey at a station using the name Warlock. And I did it half as a joke, knowing that the Warlock would link eventually to the Manson family and the whole cast of lies. And the Hinckley reminded me of Warren Hinkle, a double agent in San Francisco who I detest. So it was kind of an in-joke of Warlock Hinkle. And then this week, this clone, this Edward Richardson, appeared in New Haven, Connecticut, and New York, who was in the nearby area of Colorado, whose paths crossed with Hinckley, John Hinckley. And he said his hero was the Manson family and Squeaky Fromm and the SLA. So, and that we have a whole team of assassins, and his mentor is Carl McIntyre and the Deep Christian Church. So I knew within a week the Warlock would tie in. The whole mystical thing would go in too long to cover now, and I won't do any more in-jokes. We'll call him John Hinckley Jr., right. But I still want to call him Warlock. Okay? Now, on to the gross similarities. What are the ones, some of those that you notice, that people, young people or older people, should be noticing in this case?
Well, I noticed right from the beginning, from the earliest videotapes, that there was there was a lot of contradiction between what I saw and what the press was explaining that I saw. For example, the shots. The three men who were hit react violently to shots, and yet we see the president being pushed into the car. And I've studied the videotapes quite closely, and I'm going to get 5 more hours of them by next week, which I'll study even more closely. But I'm convinced that Reagan was not hit. If he was hit, it was by a very different kind of bullet, or if he was hit after he got into the car. The reason why I say that is that we can see McCarthy, the Secret Service man, being literally lifted off his feet by one of the shots. We can see, of course, that the police officer and Brady are felled immediately, and to lift a 179-pound man, McCarthy, off the ground requires a high-powered rifle, and also he was thrown, I would say 5 to 6 feet to our right. That is, as from the view of the camera, he's thrown right. I would say 5 or 6 feet. That would be consistent with a shot from our left, from somewhere else, where everybody, by the way, was looking as soon as the shots rang out.
From somewhere else.
All the eyes are in that direction, and then Hinckley is back here where the camera is. Now that's an indication of more than the possibility of shots from more than one direction.
Different. Also, and for those of the listeners who are too young or don't remember the Dallas comparison, when John Kennedy was shot through the throat or through the back, or John Connally, they were fairly clean bullets. And then his head exploded and the brain crashed, and that was messy. In this case, 3 men were messy, and Reagan was clean. The response was totally different.
That's right.
Coming from one gun.
And we have shots coming from the rear. The shot that went through Connally is definitely from the rear.
It was a clean bullet, though.
That was a clean bullet.
Came out pristine. It was so clean.
That's right.
Yeah, but the response of Reagan, the first story was that he walks into the hospital on his own feet, or was just thrown to the car for protection. And the reaction of Ronald Reagan was entirely different than the other 3 men.
That's true. Exactly.
Yeah.
Another thing, too, the photos are so important, I think, in both in both assassinations, JFK and the assassination attempt on President Reagan. I'm interested in the photos that must exist that were taken by newsmen standing next to the car and behind the car, photographing from in other words, photographing the whole action from the opposite point of view. In other words, Hinckley would be in these photographs.
They said they would show us those, but they never did.
They haven't yet.
They said they would.
And that should solve any doubts about Hinckley and his friend there. I'm sure you'll mention it.
Yeah, well, we'll get it. Well, that is consistent with the Warren Commission using and confiscating immediately the film of Abraham Zapruder standing on the side of the car where John Kennedy was hit from the one side, and then individual researchers, such as Richard Sprague, collecting 25,000 different photos or feet of pictures across the street where there is possibly a gunman or a man standing at the Daltex window on the stepway, and a Mr. Hicks of the security department picking up shells. And the view was entirely different from the other side. You might have gotten in researchers through the years, including the tramps being taken away and so forth. The Zapruder film only caught the fact that the president was killed.
That's right. And if these, of course, this kind of withholding of vital evidence, if these films were, if people were interested, if the FBI were really interested in solving these crimes, all they need to do is collect these photographs, and by triangulating them, we would know exactly which shots were fired, and as we can reconstruct now in Dealey Plaza.
Of course, that's another comparison. You have that quotation I gave you of the FBI. You say, if they were interested, and yet, for all purposes, the case was solved, within
That's
3
right.
days.
They said that we've got, there he is.
Yeah, we've got the case for all, we have no evidence of a conspiracy, the FBI said. We have some sheets here, you'll hear papers rattling with a description of the FBI, will come across them, saying, for all purposes, nobody else was involved.
Right.
The men investigating the case and the Justice Department.
Another important parallel that I see is the another parallel is the importance of eyewitnesses interviewed on the scene right after the events. You'll recall the eyewitnesses at Dealey Plaza in Dallas spoke of shots coming from the grassy knoll. I mean, an overwhelming majority of them. Other eyewitnesses heard shots from other directions too. And yet the Warren Commission chose to believe that all the shots came from the one
man
from the one man again. Now, eyewitnesses when the shots were fired at Reagan first said that they did not see Reagan hit. They also the reports for an hour, I believe, where the president had not been hit. I think these eyewitness accounts are very interesting. Later on in the day, when these same videotapes were being replayed, the eyewitness remarks were cut out of the tapes.
Well, the original tapes, though, whoever videotaped it right away got
those.
Even got a reference to the grassy knoll.
That's right.
They pointed to the wall and said they came from the grassy knoll.
I think somebody was trying to be funny, but it had real relevance.
Yeah.
Because one of the eyewitnesses spoke of seeing someone shooting from up there. There was some reference to a higher shot.
Yeah.
And also...
Sherman Skolnick said that I talked to him today. He's a well-known researcher in Chicago, and he said that one of the witnesses who hasn't been interviewed since then, a woman, and it wasn't Judy Woodruff, who was staying near the NBC camera. It was somebody that said they heard a crackling fire and suggested even the roof, the trajectory of higher up at the Hilton Hotel, that there was this sound coming from a crackling noise that they picked up, and this person has never been located. And also...
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I remember distinctly in one of the early videotapings, there was a young eyewitness, a young man, who was asked by one of the reporters, did you see the president hit? And he said, no, I didn't see him hit. When the shots rang out and when he was being pushed in the car, I could see that his face showed concern and that he was startled. And then he started to say more, but there was a fellow, a very imposing, tall and strong fellow behind him, happened to be a black man, who looked sort of hippie-ish, but you knew he wasn't. He was, and in a voice of quiet authority, he said, "Hold up, man. Now hold up there."
Didn't want him to talk?
Didn't want him to talk. And the young man turned around quite,
Did you get on the tape?
This is on the tape.
On the videotape.
This will undoubtedly be on the 5 hours of tape that I'm going to get from a friend next time, but I distinctly remember that.
Now, the changing of the trajectory of the bullets, one gun expert told me that in order to try and kill somebody, you aim for the arm or armpit, because it can go down to the heart if it's higher up, and if they wear a bulletproof vest, you're sure to get them. You go for the armpit and it goes down. Now, if there were somebody, again, on a roof, maybe with a silencer, with that crackling sound simultaneously, and his arm is raised, that would explain how it went 1 inch from the heart and went in the armpit.
That's right. That would explain. However, this would have had to happen pretty much as Reagan was pushed into the car, because as he is pushed into the car, he shows no sign of being hit by any high-powered rifle.
Until he gets in the car.
Well, we know that when he got in the car, he complained that the Secret Service agent Parr, is that his name?
This is something we were talking about that isn't a comparison to Kennedy, because he was good and dead.
That's right.
The interesting point is that, like you're saying, Ronald Reagan fell down and blamed the agent for breaking his rib, which would be similar to the Robert Kennedy assassination. Say if he had lived where Thane Caesar is behind him and shoots from behind, if he wasn't 1 inch from the back of the head, say the shoulder hit, where they later removed the ceiling from the ambassador and cut off the sleeve where the shots came from behind, was Ronald Reagan in the car. And that anguish on his face is that he got a bullet into the area and collapsed and blamed his fall on cracking a rib. Yeah.
In any case, Reagan's wound is not consistent with a shot fired from ground level. it's not consistent with a shot fired because he was pushed into the car, and as he's bending down, the shot would go up, right? All of the diagrams showing Reagan's wound show a very, very clean wound angling down from his armpit.
And then it changes course.
Off the rib, and then it lodges in the lung. Well,
this is like the Dallas story again. These bullets do the zigzags. They don't just go down. They ricochet. They change course. They go back up, and then they go down again.
Here's another parallel. The changing of the evidence with regard to wounds. The nature of the wounds are very important in any murder case.
And the very first day, you get an exact diagram.
Yes.
Of the bullet and the wound.
Now, they say it's a ricochet. Of course, we'll talk about that, I guess, in a minute, why they had to have 6 shots. But a ricochet bullet becomes very deformed, and it doesn't follow a neat path in any body.
So for the time it hits, then it breaks, you mean?
That's right. In other words, it's very difficult for me to buy the story that Reagan was hit by a ricochet bullet. But the ricochet bullet story, to me, must be an attempt to restrict the bullets to 6, because if we got another bullet, we've got a conspiracy. Political conspiracies don't happen in this country, right? They only happen in the Banana Republic.
Well, of course, the photographing of this scene and the photographing of Dallas are the same, and then the one you had to fit the amount of bullets into the Mannlicher Carcano in the certain amount of seconds that the film was going. And in this case, you can't have more than 6, so you have, if you have 7 bullets, one of them has to be not from where John Hinckley was standing, but from the car, which is a different direction, isn't it?
That's right, or from the front of the car. I counted the bullets. Now, at first they said that the police officer was hit by 2 bullets. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say he was hit by 1 bullet, which injured his shoulder and his neck. All right, we've got McCarthy, the Secret Service man, hit once. We've got the police officer, Delaney, I believe. He's hit once. We've got Brady hit once. We've got Reagan hit once. We've got the door hit once. We've got the window hit once, and we've got a hole in the building across the street, which I thought was a bank, but you said might
it'd be an insurance company or a bank.
Now that's 7. That's even granting them 1 shot to the police officer
in 3 seconds.
In
less than 3 seconds, almost.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't
the
know
timing was actually less than 3 seconds.
No.
And 3 were felled to the ground, and the other one is singing and dancing and wishing he was in Philadelphia, right? With blood coming out of his nose and mouth.
Yes. That's another parallel. The contradictory reports about the president's reactions to his wound.
Well, the very first confusion was so obvious when they said it was a .38 caliber. This is on the tapes.
Right.
And then it became a .22. Well, the minute John Kennedy was put into Parkland Hospital and Lee Harvey Oswald became the suspect, they were walking out of the building with the Mannlicher, with the German Mauser. And identified by the law enforcement. And that took them 24 hours to become a Mannlicher Carcano.
Right.
Now, this Hinckley, they jumped the gun on 2 things. Just like with Lee Harvey Oswald, they said it was the German Mauser. And there were Mausers in the building.
That's right.
Remember, there were 2 Mausers in the building?
In a different spot, though.
Oswald, when he was arrested, said, wait, there's Mausers in the building. Then it became a Carcano. Well, in this case, he had bought a .38, one in Dallas that was confiscated in Nashville, and then he bought a .38 in Denver, Colorado on January 21st of this year. So right away they said it was a .38, and then all of a sudden they said, no, it's a .22, because he bought that from poor old Mr. Goldstein. We'll get into that. And it became a .22, but where did they get the confusion, again, about the nature of the bullets, or 3 days later saying that they're hollow bullets?
That they're hollow bullets or explosive. And that was another fuzzy thing, the difference between explosive bullets and hollow had poison-filled bullets with poison cartridges in. Going back to the Mauser and Carcano, maybe our listeners should maybe they don't understand that the German Mauser rifle is generally considered by experts in firearms to be one of the most deadly and deadly accurate weapons for any kind of killing. And the Italian Carcano is universally recognized as the worst. It's completely outdated. So we're not talking about just an unimportant point here. In other words, if if a .38 was used, we might be able to explain the force of the missile that hit McCarthy.
Totally different.
Totally different.
The
from
three
a
of them,
22.
yes. And then the
Yes.
one little 22.
Right. Yeah, this is a parallel which is very important because the hard evidence, the ballistics evidence, is so essential. And of course, the ballistics evidence was messed up and messed with very early on in the Kennedy assassination.
So what we get is a difference in what the weapon was, a difference in the direction, a discrepancy on how many could go out in a given time. The witnesses that had one version that are never called to present themselves. The one thing you're getting in this case is the silence of the surgeons you mentioned.
Yes, to this moment, they've never been interviewed.
Never been seen. They're not going to go on a limb like Commander Hume and say it went this way or that way.
All of the doctors at Parkland Hospital, for example, for I think it was a day and a half, said that the first shot that hit Kennedy in the neck was an entrance shot. Well, after the FBI interviewed them, then it suddenly became an exit wound, and then it makes these doctors look silly. So I can appreciate the fact that they might not want to go out on a limb describing the real operation that was performed on our president now.
One of the points of the comparisons that I made note is that at the time that John Kennedy was killed, the Secret Service and all the people made a run in a different direction than when Lee Harvey Oswald was. And in this case, everyone was looking in a different place than where John Hinckley.
They were looking straight ahead, and Hinckley was to their left.
Up to the left,
That's
yes.
Right. And also, well, yeah, finish.
No, go on.
I'm sorry,
that's okay.
there's so much to talk about.
We could do 3 hours.
But I find it very suspicious. There's another parallel here. I found it suspicious that the president had to walk so far to the limousine from this exit that the car was not parked directly in front of the exit, which seems to me to be the safest thing to do.
He had to make a slant.
He had to turn. Yes, he had to walk quite a ways, and the car was a weird slant right at the curve of that drive. Now, in the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination, we see very clearly that the presidential limousine slows down as they approach.
Stops.
It almost stops when it gets to the grassy knoll area. And these are very suspicious things.
They didn't escalate till after he was hit. And in this case, they had him walking farther at an angle, which would be really difficult. I also think if he was walking straight from the door to the car, probably through the arm or something, there'd be less chance of getting the heart. At the angle that he was at, he was more at an angle where it'd be easier to get him.
Well, I think the parallel in both cases, yeah, that's true. The parallel in both cases is that both moves put the president in greater danger, contrary to standard Secret Service procedure.
Yeah.
In other words, well, you get into the secret.
Well,
you've got a note there about the parallels, about the protecting of the president.
Yeah.
All of these rules that are violated, standard practices violated by the Secret Service in both instances.
The favors of law enforcement. Well, one of the shocking articles was in the Washington Post this week, April 3rd, where Mr. Knight, Director Stuart Knight of the Secret Service, said that this potential assassin was in the audience right on the street, a known potential assassin, well known to the Secret Service as a possible threat, was in the crowd of onlookers. And the diversionary in all of this was John. He was acting up, even though he was a known threat, and people were watching him, when it was John Hinckley who really was just standing there. And they didn't apprehend him or take him off the street, and Mr. Knight said the person that people thought was Hinckley, acting like a herky-jerky manner he uses, I don't know where he gets that from, just before the shots rang out, was already a known person in the Secret Service, and they ascertained that he posed no threat. Well, was he ever frisked? If everybody is looking at the single hand going out, is that the only one that's shooting? It's such a posture to stick your hand straight out, of this motley group and just throw away those bullets.
There was no question in my mind, looking at the videotapes, that hand was firing shots. You can see the pistol recoil, but this business of he's the one, this propensity to think, to make us believe that when you find one man, you've solved the crime.
Well, that's like Sirhan's attorney saying when it came out that there was evidence of a second gun. He said, well, being as my client was there with the intent to shoot, he's guilty anyway. It doesn't matter, with the intent. Sirhan could be a diversionary shooting around the place where the fatal bullet comes from behind, from a security guard. So what you get here is a situation where the security guards are all looking at one man and jumping him. Mm-hmm. Where did the herky-jerky guy go that was the risk?
That's right. And
well, did they run and grab him too? If they a herky-jerky, I don't think Mr. Stewart Knight uses that often. That he's making all the funny faces, and he's the diversionary. Did anyone run for him?
From obviously not.
Maybe he was holding the .38 that Hinckley got in. Who knows what the guys were hit from, and maybe Hinckley was working with somebody on the street. They all ran for the one person.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a real peril. It's got to be a lone assassin. They come on the air immediately after all political assassinations in this country. Some authority comes on the air immediately, even before the facts are in, even before all of the elementary facts are in, and they say no conspiracy.
Well, this is why I think Jack Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald was done on camera, because if you saw him shoot, somebody else wasn't holding his hand, and therefore there was no conspiracy. They don't go into the telephone call or really go to probe of how he knew what time Oswald would come through the basement or how he got into the basement. If you saw him shoot, therefore he did it alone. And if you see John Hinckley there, he did it alone. Mm-hmm. And you saw his hand, didn't you?
You saw his hand, didn't you?
Time Magazine and Newsweek, and they all have it. This is the end of the first half hour. We're going to take a 1-minute break. This goes too fast.
Already?
Isn't that terrible? We'll take a break. This is Mae Brussell and Ray Fabrizio and Carmel, and we'll be back with you in 1 minute.
World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, this is Mae Brussell and Ray Fabrizio, and we'll go back with some more comparisons of the John Kennedy assassination and the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, because I think Ray and I both agree he probably won't outlive, for one reason or another, he's not going to go through these 4 years as president. He's been marked. So for all purposes, this is just the first gun, don't you think?
I'm afraid so.
I think so. There were other comparisons I just want to mention briefly, and I'll do more of this next week when I'm on the air. This January in 1981, in front of my house, January the 13th, there was a very suspicious car I could see from my window in the study, and I looked up, and this white car was sitting there with a male in there, and I asked them what they were doing there about 10 minutes, and they were looking for a room to rent in my house. The woman said she'd been there before, an older woman, about 5 or 6 years older than the man, and he was spaced out on, it looked like drugs, and she looked like a tired kind of a hippie. And I made a note that he was 24 years old and stocky and a wide face, and they said that somebody in the house spoke German, and if I didn't have a room for them, maybe he could do some electrical work for me. And I asked to see his driver's license. It was 517 TSF, and he said his name was John Randall, and that he lived in Santa Barbara. And I typed all this up because I was going to L.A. the next day and made note that he appeared to have this sort of Artie Bremer face, and he wouldn't answer questions, and she did the talking, and I asked him if he would talk. And I remembered just this week the John and the white automobile and Ronald Reagan's home base in Santa Barbara, and John Hinckley being in California very often and not accounted for from October the 9th of 1980 until January 21st, 1981, where he shows up in Colorado. And I called the FBI and the Secret Service. They said the name on the license does not match this John Randall, whoever he was. And I had told a member of my family, I think I've seen the stormtrooper in front of the house. For all the world, he looked like a Nazi stormtrooper. So when the story came out about this John Hinckley was interesting to me. He was about the same age, 1 year difference, the same body description, the same appearance, the same spaced out description that the Botel people gave in Colorado just before he came to California. And his interest in the Kennedy assassination is, I understand, in Colorado, there's locked up in his family's home all these articles about Kennedy and John Lennon, and I had been for years doing connections of the Nazi Party, the Kennedy assassination, and the conspiracy of John Lennon. And he had a lot of satisfaction in the Lennon murder and was consumed with the researchers, and even had a picture of Oswald with him when he was doing these shootings. So I'll follow more next week on this subject, but I was calling the Secret Service and the FBI. This was Thursday night, and Friday morning at 8:30 in the morning, I got a telephone call from Marina Oswald in Texas, and Ray and I were talking about that before we went on the air, and I'll share that with you later. I don't want to divert from what we're doing, but I just, the people that take the tapes every week and are interested in this as a running process of understanding what is going on, I thought it was interesting that Marina called me, and we talked for about a half hour, because I was looking into the possibility of the Hinckley family and the oil engineers in Texas working with Marina and the people that she knew in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So it was quite a shock to get a call from her and talk about these matters just at the time I was investigating them. Now let's get back to the other coincidences or similarities, whatever they are. I don't think they're coincidences.
No, I'm afraid not. Maybe one, you have so much interesting stuff to get into. I don't want to take too much time here,
No.
But I think another parallel that is obvious is the need to create a motive for these, quote, lone assassins. You know, I mean, they said that Lee Harvey Oswald killed, I mean, after all, you have to have a motive, right? Well, Lee Harvey Oswald was dead, so they could create any motive they wanted. And the story, the official story, is that Oswald killed Kennedy in order to go down in history.
The history. Oh, that's...
And yet he denied, of course, the motive. This motive is so absurd because a man who wants to go down in history as a killer of a president would proudly proclaim it, yet Oswald denied it always. Now, they've come up with a motive for Hinckley.
Yes.
He's in love with... I guess you mentioned that in your last tape, though, didn't you?
Well, a little bit. I mean, he wanted to be known as a person, you know, historical in stature to prove his love for her.
Right.
A nobody who wanders. Well, you know, I've often said you take people that work in espionage like E. Howard Hunt. His children didn't even know he was a master spy for 20 years until Watergate. They don't go to known places. They don't have neon signs.
Of course not. They don't leave diaries. I think it's peculiar. It seems to me, this, and I don't mean this in any unpatriotic sense, but it's only Americans who seem to believe these Disneyland stories. You know, can you imagine a European believing
that you leave notes around?
I mean, these stories, they can't even come up with really sophisticated stories. To me, they're patently suspicious.
Well, I think that in order to close the case within 24 hours, you have to have the motive right there. And the adjectives that they've used, which we compare, say, the Kennedy assassination tonight to John Hinckley, were used also with Sirhan, charged with killing Robert Kennedy, James Earl Ray, with Martin Luther King, with Artie Bremer, the Wallace shooting, the SLA with their writings on the wall, or the Manson family, death to the pigs. And these notorious diaries are supposed to divert you from these lonely wanderers who go in and out of countries, who have passports, who, like John Hinckley, graduates from high school and travels for 7 years without only one arrest, and he's out in 34 minutes, staying Delta Airlines, American Airlines, the Sheraton hotels, motels with swimming pools. He has a car. He leaves at his parents' house. They tell you how he's going back and forth, the Dan White story, to McDonald's for hamburgers. Well, what about that white Valeri car he had, or whatever it was? You know, he has wheels. He has gas. It costs money as much as us. He's in college a few years. He's up in Illinois. He's in Washington, D.C., where he's pictured in front of the White House. Lee Harvey Oswald, you know, the route from the Marines to home base to New Orleans to Paris and Le Havre and Finland and Moscow and then back home, and the government pays his way. A loner rejected every time.
The loner rejected.
James Earl Ray's in London. He's in Portugal. He's up in Montreal. They're all over the world.
I've often wondered what there is about these concocted, simplistic stories that Americans seem to eat up. I think it's that I think we desperately want to believe that that political assassination is simply a non-American phenomenon, and we'll go so far as to believe these cartoon fictions.
Well, see, the problem is that we will accept that bullets fly. We will recognize the president of Jamaica when 27 people plus more were murdered for him to be elected. The president of Korea comes in at the dinner he shoots his successor. Right. We get Pinochet, who actually guns down literally, Salvador Allende. Everyone we're recognizing came in through the absolute slaying of the people before them. And then we can't say that the vice president or the secretary of state wants the power now because their espionage system is getting unglued because of multinational banking scandals and the involvement of CIA with Nazis and narcotics. We can't say we've got to cover the gaps and Reagan's too new in Washington. We can't. I have the luxury of saying that thanks to my audience and friends, but the average person doesn't have the luxury of even saying it out loud. Even thinking the worst and proving it was wrong.
Yes.
Much less thinking the worst and proving it was true.
That's right.
So that everyone they entertain is a gangland banana republic crook. And we want to pretend that the succession is orderly and that this loner.
Yes. All we need is more psychiatrists to keep our kids from being toilet trained too early because they end up killing presidents. That's the. Well,
you go to the hotel room and there's a letter to Jodie Foster, and the headline says the motive is there,
yes.
The lonely wanderer, and that they were neglected by everybody. Society never recognized them. He wanted to be like his brother, and he wanted to be like his sister, the homecoming queen, and he just went to. There's a Yiddish word, Nebbish College.
Right.
It's not the Harvard of the South. Well, Vanderbilt isn't Harvard either. They have to put that in, that it's the Harvard of the South. It's still just old Vanderbilt.
Yeah. There's another parallel there to the cooperation of the press. Was so necessary in the Kennedy assassination, and it's so necessary now. The press answers the questions at the same time that they're asked, and they're neat little answers for people who don't want to delve into them.
I spent the whole week just taking the Washington Post, the 2 pages in that, last Sunday on the 5th of April, and the New York Times, the whole page on the Hinckley family. And I typed, like the headline of the Washington Post, an aimless road to a place in history, Hinckley's Odyssey and Troubles. See, then I listed what they leave out, that it wasn't necessarily aimless. He was protected by the judge in Nashville, Tennessee. He's protected by the FBI who don't fingerprint him. He's protected by his travels. As soon as the guns go off, he's taken to a Marine base. He doesn't have to go to ordinary jail.
Protected by the FBI
He's
also,
protected by...
because they didn't furnish his name to the Secret Service.
Never fingerprinted him. And he's protected by the CIA. He gets the most expensive attorney in the United States. He's protected by the courts that locked up all of his belongings and writings that should be available for a case, because now if Reagan isn't dead, of course you're not going to expose that. But I spent the entire week just listing, like the Washington Post, this is their great article, Chip Brown and Neil Henry. Failure to graduate from college, failure to get a job, failure to measure to his brother and sister, failure to connect with his father, failure to distinguish life from art, failure to be recognized by Jodie Foster.
Oswald again, all this failure.
So what I said is success. He obtained 7 weapons and traveled all over the country with them. Success. He was caught with 3 guns and 50 rounds of ammunition and was never fingerprinted at the airport. Success. He took courses on Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf and slave labor in Auschwitz, where no other colleges hardly teach German Nazi history in any places that I know of. Success in locating Jodie Foster and finding the door to put notes under her, which would be very difficult. A college like Yale with a guy who's freaked out, at least as spacey as the one I saw in front of my house. After 10 minutes, I said, go, you're danger to me. You know, success at having his own car and driving around without ever being seen and nobody knowing where he gets his gas. Success in getting 50 hollow bullets and inflicting almost mortal wounds and not being announced for days that they're in these people. Success to find out where the president would be at that moment, which is pretty hard to do, and success to get in and out of college, never having debts or any problems paying your airline fees, living in California 2 or 3 years, no job in his life, traveling. They mentioned Delta Airlines, American Airlines, flying around, buying one gun for 100. All they did, they mentioned 3 little items he hawked, like they found a pawn shop, a $15 silver watch in Hollywood Boulevard 5 years ago. And they can't find where he bought gas or if he was in front of my house in January. Isn't that like Oswald, the most minute details of babysitters, success at traveling to Texas, Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Nashville, New York, New Haven, Washington, D.C., never saying who took his picture in front of the White House, who he saw in Washington, D.C., his links. Success when he was arrested, not taken to an ordinary jail with other homicide cases. As I said before, getting his top lawyer. Where did he fail? I asked the question to myself. Yeah. He almost got Haig and Fritz Kramer's protege into office, and Bush, director of the CIA. Maybe this is what he wanted to do. Maybe he is helping a group of people that have claimed since the Kennedy assassination, and in volume 17 and 18 verbatim, if we did 8 or 10 murders, we would control the United States. Maybe he's doing just what he likes to do. Why? I don't see any inkling that he suffered.
That's right, and he was successful in getting in with the TV crew there. So when you need a Secret Service press card, not just an ordinary press card, but you have to have clearance with the Secret Service to get in there.
Of course. I mean, these wanderers, you just don't wander, and they take down the guardrail and so forth. You just,
of course,
everything that he wanted that would prove to a certain group of people, say that Reagan had to be done away with, every door was open for him. And people were predicting from the time Reagan won the election that he wouldn't live out his term, that it would be 3 or 4 months. And here's this guy at the right time, the right place, and Reagan still isn't out of the woods.
Yeah. And Time magazine is still at their old tricks. I mean, this article in the recent one showing this cartoon picture of Reagan, and the trying to present, I think the word madness is in the title, and they're trying to suggest that the country is mad. That's why presidents get killed. In other words, it's a kind of illness, and that we're all guilty somehow.
Yeah,
that propaganda campaign is very dangerous, because when if we're feeling guilt about firearms or something like that, then we tend not to be active in rectifying situations. Guilt is a very harmful emotion in that sense. You feel guilty, so you give up control.
Yes.
And they're trying to make Americans feel guilty for
this violence.
And
all of these assassinations.
Right.
Is America violent? And yet, if they would write those editorials after they've accounted for who took his picture, such as when E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy broke into Dr. Fielding's office, they had their picture. It was very common for the Nazis to be photographed where they did things and how they did them. They kept a record of everything. And he's smiling in front of the White House. And until the FBI or the Justice Department says who took the picture and what date and where he stayed and what phone calls he received, how can they say within 2 days that he's the loner? The Secret Service was directly across the street from the hotel that he stayed in, the headquarters. And they make note that he's near the White House, but they don't say he's near the Secret Service office, or that the agents were always over at the hotel having drinks.
Does that remind you of Oswald passing out supposedly pro-Castro leaflets out of the same building that housed the CIA office in New Orleans?
In New Orleans. That was another parallel, is that by Lee Harvey Oswald being seen with an altercation there, they could say that he had confrontations with the law enforcement, that he was having pro-Castro pamphlets. And as soon as he was put in jail, he called the FBI and said, "Let me out." Well, I think a parallel here, and I think you'd agree, is that going through Nashville and apprehended with these weapons the day Carter was there made it look like he's stalking or assimilated to Carter, so that if he shoots Reagan, it's a senseless thing. The media twisted around that it was just senseless.
They keep using that word all the time.
Senseless and wandering. Surian, the wanderer. They wander, but what motels, they find the tackiest witnesses, like a maintenance man from a dormitory 5 years ago can have instant recall that all the shades were closed and he only had a TV. He may have had the shades closed, just like when Howard used room, all the shades were closed over the window so that nobody from an airplane could take a photograph of who was in the room. This is the truth. In the upper floors, they put boards over every window when they were wondering who was in those rooms, and black curtains. So for Howard Hughes, it's normal, but for Hinckley, it's a sign of a withdrawn inner person.
Right. Like if a guy's robbing a liquor store and he kills the clerk, they don't say senseless murder. I mean, that's not senseless. He's killing the clerk in order to rob the store. But when somebody kills a president, it's a senseless killing.
Sherman Skolnick believes that Hinckley can be attached to a man in Chicago, and possibly he was involved in a murder in a Jew in Chicago in 1977. He's putting this together, that Hinckley was working with the Nazi Party and an agent from the CIA who traveled all around the world. But the adjectives that we get with John Kennedy and all the others that we don't have time to go into with Hinckley, the wanderer, the loner, the senseless, the searching for history.
And of course, they try to say that about Oswald, but we know too much about the real Oswald now. We know about the intelligence man at Atsugi Naval Base, the man who we have him on tape speaking excellent English, speaking beautifully. And I have no doubt that we'll find out that Hinckley may have some of the same background that Oswald had. Well, connections with intelligence. Well, you've already established some.
Well, I was wondering about a group that went to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and the oil people, all of the people left. There are two areas that I've always pursued with the Kennedy assassination that I believe separated me from the intelligence agents that pretended to be doing the work. And one was the Torbett document with the missionary in the church front, particularly Albert Osborne from Nashville, Tennessee, who ran a Nazi camp of Boy Scouts funded through Permindex with his headquarters in Jamaica at Tyrol Bay, who was on the bus with Lee Harvey Oswald into Mexico. And the missionary that he had were not religious scout people, but assassins working with Division 5 of the FBI. Now, that was an area that very few people would use, and when I called Robert Blakey of the House Select Committee and said, do you have the Torbett document, he said, I won't answer you. I said, I'll send it to you. He said, I won't answer you, and he hung up. And it's interesting because this family, the Hinckley family, were devoutly Christian and working with the World Vision Group, which is a missionary group around the world in 85 countries that could possibly be an umbrella cloak for the intelligence operation. A religious, they call it third world, but they mention Nigeria and Brazil and other non-third world countries. And is this the kind of missionary Christian group that funded Albert Osborne? Christian church groups from California, the Southwest, Oregon, all listed in the Warren Commission hearings, sending money to a man in Tennessee that they thought was a religious person, and he in turn gave it to assassins. And at the time that Hinckley went through Tennessee, when he was apprehended at the airport with handcuffs and 50 rounds of hollow ammunition and 3 guns, they let him off in 34 minutes, and his brother went to Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, and then to Singapore for an oil company, so that there's a ball of wax here. And the other area of the Kennedy assassination that people, Lane and Sylvia Marr and the other researchers, wouldn't touch was all that information in the volumes, volume 18, page 700 and 800, of the links of men brought from Germany, military intelligence, into the Dallas area meeting with the CIA. There's a whole can of worms of people that had youth groups that would be very useful for future murders. And I wonder if in the 10 years after John Kennedy was killed, they picked up these young people, like these Hinckleys, John Hinckley, who came from arch conservative redneck, really Nazi mentality, the G. Gordon Liddy mentality, and that their son was not a bad branch off of their tree, but a part of the family tree, working more actively for getting the show on the road of getting a real fascist coup in this country, moving Reagan out. So this neo-Nazi group in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I'll do more of it on other tapes, was the Hinckley family part of that milieu? What is the unfinished business of Dallas, like the missionaries, the church fronts, the assassination teams, which overlaps with the Hinckley family now with the missionaries and the untold money. In 1973-74, when Hinckley moved to Denver, Colorado, according to the Wall Street Journal, he was bankrupt. He had no money. And then Vanderbilt Energy all of a sudden came into a lot of money. And those were the same years where the Australian CIA money with narcotics and the Phoenix program and the assassination teams was dispersing money. And is the unfinished business of the Mo Dallas, Castle Bank, Giancana, Rosselli, even though they're dead, are those people still working for that one world fascism, as against what they call the one world Rockefeller communism? The far right considers David Rockefeller a one world giveaway, and anything that touches him is a communist one world, whereas they have said we will assassinate or kill to make sure we're not in the clutches of, say, Chase Manhattan. So is the Hinckley group out of that fabric that began when Kennedy was killed? They lived right in the neighborhood. They were there till 74.
If that connection exists, how arrogant, how audacious these people are. I mean, the connection between the Hinckley and the vice president is so close. I mean, they must have a lot of they must have a lot of confidence to
Well, it'd be as audacious as on November 23rd if Lee Harvey Oswald's daughter is having dinner with Lyndon Johnson's daughter at the ranch. If she were old enough, if Rachel was 20 and is having lunch with Lyndon's daughter on the 23rd. If Oswald... yes, I think to have this person arrested and airlifted to a military base and then hire the law office of Williams and Connolly, when Connolly was so much a part of the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And Williams, their attorney, was covering up the Bobby Baker, the Lyndon Johnson connections, the Connolly, the Watergate. He's been the attorney for this whole ball of wax. So that beyond the ballistics, you get into the oil energy, connecting links of the family, the neighborhood they lived in, H.L. Hunt's, the extreme right wing, and the media tries to present Hinckley as being a kid that somehow went sour. And we were talking about this before. The Texas rule of thumb was kill. Why, even Lyndon Johnson, our own president, was suspected of murdering the man whose seat he took. It plays on Broadway like McBird. Why do we talk about South Korea? The literature that came out naming Lyndon Johnson as taking over because of the murder, there's some people that dare say it here. So I think the comparisons to Dallas, they exist because they haven't been cleaned up. Don't you think so?
That's right. And I think if Dallas had been studied at the time, these shots would never have been fired at Reagan.
That's right. And if it were studied today, it would stop more shots.
That's right.
It would get us back away from the bullets or blackmail and into the election box again and having a free choice. The people innocently, I said this to the Republicans when they would put me down for doing research on the Kennedy assassination. I said, just wait till you get the man in that you want and see how long he lives. See if you really have a choice in this country. And a lot of Republicans began to see a little better, I think, in the last week and a half.
That's very interesting, yeah. I think it's going to throw a lot of light on the kind of hidden government that's speaking right now.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry our hour is over. I think we could do about 10 or 20 hours on the similarities. They never end, but it begins with the ballistics and then gets deeper into specific people and places and time. Thank you very much, Ray, for being here.
It's my
really
pleasure,
great.
Mae. It's always fun to talk to you.
Okay, this is Mae Brussell and Carmel. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.